Well, hello there. I didn't see you come in. Make yourself at home. Have a drink. While I give some attention to some underappreciated characters and storylines that I personally love. And I hope you grow to love as well.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome back. Today we are reading Swamp Thing number 132. And just a little catch up on what's been going on. A couple issues back, Swamp Thing left Abby to go fight some monster in New Jersey. And because previously Swamp Thing had made Abby a promise that he would never leave her again for something for the green, he decided it would be a good idea to just make a double of himself that could temporarily take his place while he's off beating this monster. And he's only expecting it to take, a day or two. But that is not what happens. It ends up that he got poisoned, his body began to decompose, he couldn't go through the green, so he had to walk all the way from New Jersey down to Louisiana. And I think it takes him a total of like 2 weeks to get down there. And in the meantime, his doppelganger has been enjoying the family life. He loves the way it feels when Tefe calls him daddy, and when Abby kisses him and tells him that she loves him. So his love for this whole family situation has been growing in the background. And in the last issue, we saw Swamp Thing run into some elven folk that live in the Appalachian Mountains, and they help Swamp Thing rid his body of the toxins, and they actually help him grow a new body. And this new body looks a lot different from the old one. It's got spikes all over its arms and back. He's got vines growing out of his head that make him look like he has really long hair. And I believe I mentioned this last time, but this is lovingly referred to as the grunge Swamp Thing. So Swamp Thing in his new body is finally able to go through the green, so he instantly gets back to Louisiana. And at first he approaches Tefe. She cries because she doesn't recognize him. Then he approaches Abby, and Abby is freaked out because she does not recognize him either. And we are left with her calling out for Alec, who she thinks is the doppelganger. And the doppelganger Swamp Thing runs to help her, and we ended the last issue with the two Swamp Things squaring off about to battle. So first things first, with issue 132, we got the cover here. We see Abby is in the middle of the woods. It looks like the trees are trying to reach out to her with branch arms that look like they have pointy fingers, and they're about to scratch her. And Abby looks terrified as she holds herself in fear. And we see that this issue is written by Nancy A. Collins with art by Scott Eaton and Kim DeMulder. And as we turn to the first page, we see the name of this issue is Homebody. And we get a full page splash of both Swamp Things facing each other, and Abby is holding on to the doppelganger Swamp Thing because it looks like her original Alec, and she's saying, "Alec?" And then Swamp Thing points at his double and says, "You are a thing of my creation. I made you to serve in my place when I was called away by the green. This is my family, my life, not yours." And the doppelganger responds, "You have no right to claim them as yours. You abandoned your wife after promising you would not leave her side. You betrayed the trust of the ones who love you. Thereby, you forfeited your right to serve as her husband." So now Abby is staring at them, and she's realizing that what the Swamp Thing in the new body had told her last time is true, that this one that she's been living with is the doppelganger. And she looks at the doppelganger and says, "No, Alec, tell me it's not true." We see the doppelganger get a very angry look on his face and not answer Abby because everything's falling apart. He had everything perfect the way he wanted it with his family, and now it's going away. So as the anger and tension builds between the two Swamp Things, Abby looks at both of them and says, "Alec, answer me, damn you." And then simultaneously, the two Swamp Things rush at each other and begin fighting. And it's funny because Abby yells out Alec, but you don't know if she's yelling for the doppelganger or for the new bodied Swamp Thing. Then we cut to Houma, Louisiana, and specifically the Houma Police Department. And we see a man sitting at a desk, and we've seen this man before. He is the African-American police officer that helped Abby get Tefe back when she got kidnapped by that child serial killer. So as he sits at his desk doing paperwork, we see Representative Barron come into his office and say, "Excuse me. Hi, I'm Ben Barron. I'm looking for Officer Rawls." And we also see an African-American woman walking next to Barron, and she is with the CPS or Child Protective Services. So Rawls looks up and says, "I'm Rawls." And Barron puts on his fake smile and says, "I'm here with Miss Stanley to see that papers are served on a citizen of your lovely parish." And Rawls replies, "Terrebonne has several thousand citizens, Mr. Barron. Which one in particular are you talking about?" And Miss Stanley answers, "Abigail Arcane Cable." And Officer Rawls thinks for a moment and he says, that name sounds familiar. hey, do you mean his wife? And I have no way how he could have forgotten that Abigail Arcane is Swamp Thing's wife. Apparently, Officer Rawls has a really bad memory. So Baron walks over to his desk closer and hands Rawls some papers and says, I have a court order authorizing the removal of one female Caucasian child named Tefe from the care of her biological mother, pending a hearing in family court. You are to help escort Miss Stanley and myself to the cable woman's place of residence and ensure that said removal is carried out per letter of the law. And Rawls cuts in saying, whoa, hold on a minute. You're planning on going into the swamps and trying to take his child away from his woman? Man, you gotta be out of your mind. And then Baron gets very angry and he says, do I have to remind you that you are a civil servant, mister? And then he points at Rawls very angrily. And then him and Rawls stare at each other for a minute and they both don't want to back down. But eventually, Rawls backs down and he says, okay, it's your funeral. Then we come back to the Swamp Thing fight and we see the two are going at it pretty hard. Swamp Thing's new body has spikes on his knuckles on his hands. So as he punches the double, it does a lot of damage and takes good chunks out of the double's body. And as this fighting is going on, Swamp Thing's narration says, I strike out without thinking, driven by pure jealous rage. My double should not be alive. Clearly there is much I still do not know about my elemental nature and that of my doppelganger. So it looks like Swamp Thing is winning. His new body is pretty strong and seems to be much stronger than the doppelgangers. But while the doppelganger's on the ground, all of a sudden vines begin to grow and shoot out from his body and they completely wrap around him and tie him up. And Swamp Thing's narration says, the cure administered by the folk has left me in this altered state, yet I am still the reigning earth elemental. And with that narration being said in the panel underneath, we see Swamp Thing gather his strength and then snap a bunch of vines around his arms, and then he grabs hold of the other ones that are attached to him, and he pulls as hard as he can. And he pulls so hard that the left arm of the doppelganger, which is the one attached to those specific vines, gets pulled off. And the doppelganger yells, "Ah!" And Swamp Thing's narration over that says, no pretender may stand before my wrath. So the doppelganger goes down in pain, and he lands on one knee, but then he places his hand down on the ground, seemingly to stabilize himself, but actually, he grows a giant Venus flytrap from right beneath Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing's surprised by this, and he says, what? And then the giant mouth of the Venus flytrap begins to try to close around him, and Swamp Thing just stands up and he holds it open, and then he begins to think really hard, and all of a sudden, vines shoot out of the ground and grab the doppelganger. So now they're both struggling in each other's traps, and Swamp Thing's narration says, we each attack without mercy, heedless of the effects our actions may have on the green. Then we get a couple flashes of what's going on with the plant life in Louisiana. And in the first one, we see LeBeau is pushing one of his boats on the bayou, and lilies begin to spring up out of the water and grow super big, and LeBeau says, Que diable! Then we cut to somewhere else where a dog is being taken by a willow tree, and the dog is crying out as the vines wrap around it, and the dog's master is calling to the dog saying, Yeller! Then we see another Cajun woman who is farming pumpkins, and these pumpkins have grown teeth and mouths, and they are attacking her hoe. Then we cut to inside Swamp Thing's house, where we see the flower people that Tefe made a while back have begun to build their civilization with their new ruler, who the last time we saw killed their old ruler and is now head of these flower people. So as he's directing them, all of a sudden he falls to the ground in pain, and the other flower people flee in fear from him. Then we cut to Gotham City, where in a cell, we see Poison Ivy is sitting, and she looks like she's in pain, but I don't know if she's in pain from the green, or if it's just because her plants look like they're freaking out as well, and she's saying, stop it, you're hurting them, please stop. Then we cut to New York City, where we see a character I don't really know that much about, but I believe this is Black Orchid. And if you don't know what she looks like, her whole body is purple, and she has like Bride of Frankenstein hair that stands straight up, and then across her eyes and continuing up to her hair is a bar of white. And I guess she was just sitting in a tree in the middle of New York, possibly napping, and she is awoken or disturbed by a nest that becomes alive and starts eating the birds that are in it. So she flies up out of the tree, and as she does that, we see her hovering through the air, and below her in another area in the park, we see Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, which we haven't seen in a while in this comic, and he's just sitting on a bench feeding some squirrels peanuts, and as the peanuts fall to the ground, they're like shelled peanuts, and they grow a mouth and they grow legs, and they begin to chase after the squirrels that were eating them. And Woodrue says, "Oh my, this doesn't look good. Not good at all." Then we cut to London, England, where we see John Constantine, the Hellblazer, and he's lighting a cigarette, and just before the cigarette lights, we see the tobacco begin to sprout and grow a face. And John says, "Bloody hell, what's that sodden cabbage up to now?" Then we cut back to Louisiana and into the house of the neighbor of Chester, who, if you remember, is the bigoted, racist, and homophobic person who called Baron in the first place to warn him that Abby had been hanging around dressing like a whore. And he's also the man that got the KKK to burn a cross on Chester's lawn in order to scare away the gay roommate of Chester and his black boyfriend. So he's at his dinner table and he's talking to his wife and he's saying, "What I tell you, Wilma, do I have connections or what? All I had to do was make a couple of calls to the right people, and the next thing you know, them hippie queers next door is history." Then he picks up the sandwich in front of him, which we definitely see has lettuce on it, and he continues, "You see, that's what you get when you screw around with Lester Bardot." And then he takes a big bite of the sandwich, and as he chews, he begins to struggle, and then all of a sudden, lettuce begins to grow out of his mouth, and I'm also assuming it's growing down his throat and choking him because he grabs for his throat and then falls down dead to the ground. Then we cut back to the bayous of Terrebonne Parish, where we see Officer Rawls riding with Miss Stanley and Baron, and they're on one of those big fan boats, which, if you haven't seen, is just a flat-bottom boat with a giant fan on the back of it that pushes it along through the swamps. And Baron is asking, "How much longer before we reach our destination, Rawls?" And Officer Rawls answers, "That's Officer Rawls, Mr. Baron." But Baron ignores that and just continues saying, "I have a very busy agenda. I can't spend all day crawling around these godforsaken swamps looking for a monster and his floozy." And Rawls answers, "Look, Baron, I don't know what your beef is with the swamp man, but you're wrong about him being a monster. Sure, when I first met him, I thought he was some kind of freak, but later he helped me track down and get rid of a real monster. And he might not look like you and me, but he's good folks." And then Baron, being the asshole racist that he is, says, "Well, maybe he doesn't look like me." But before he can finish the insult he was about to say to Officer Rawls, the boat is attacked by giant trees that begin to grow around them. And the trees don't just grow giant, they also begin to grow arms and faces, and they begin to attack the boat. And in doing so, Miss Stanley, the Child Protective Services worker, gets grabbed out of the boat by one of the trees and thrown into the water. And she lands saying, "Help me! Dear God, somebody help!" And she's not just yelling that because she just got attacked by trees. She turns to her left and sees an alligator just sitting on the bank a couple feet from her, about to enter the water. And Officer Rawls tries to do something, but the second he does, he gets wrapped up in a bunch of vines, and he yells out to Baron, "Baron, for the love of God, do something." And Baron just sits on the boat in fear, I guess, but also he's racist, so he doesn't care what happens to the black CPS worker or Officer Rawls. So the alligator moves into the water and proceeds to kill the CPS worker. And we don't see that graphically, we just see the men's reactions as she yells out, "Help! Help!" And then we hear a crunch and crack sound, and Baron covers his mouth like he gets sick, and Officer Rawls says, "No!" Then we cut back to the Swamp Thing's fight, just as the doppelganger is giving one big punch to Swamp Thing, and Swamp Thing flies backwards and lands really hard on his back, and the doppelganger says, "Had enough?" And we see Swamp Thing get mad at that, and he's about to stand and retaliate, but a hand comes out of nowhere and touches Swamp Thing's shoulder, and Swamp Thing turns and says, "Abby?" But we see it's not Abby, it's actually Lady Jane, and she says, "Prime Founder, you are going about this all wrong." And then she helps him to his feet and continues, "You can never defeat your doppelganger through sheer force. This is no inferior copy, but an actual part of your very being. While you were gone, I kept a careful eye on your double. His love for Abby is genuine, for it is yours." And Swamp Thing looks at her and says, "What do you mean by that?" And she replies, "Your rival is not an upstart creation. He is part of you. He is that which values the love of a woman, the comfort of a family. And then she looks at Swamp Thing kind of sternly and says, "Are you so determined to reclaim your family that you would destroy the part of you that loves them?" And just as Swamp Thing's about to answer, he's wrapped once again in vines and pulled backwards. And as the doppelganger tries to force him back into the fight with the vines, he says, "Why did you have to return? I would have happily remained with my family while you tended to the needs of the green." And as Swamp Thing struggles with the vines, he says, "I came back because I belong here with my loved ones." And this angers the doppelganger and he yells out, "No, they are no longer." But before he can finish, he gets pulled off of his feet and we see Swamp Thing standing above him. And it turns out that Swamp Thing has taken control of the doppelganger's vines, which makes sense because they're part of the green. And he is now forcing the doppelganger to the ground with them. And the doppelganger is saying, "What is going on? What are you doing?" And Swamp Thing says to him, "Reclaiming that which is mine." And then we see the vines slowly begin to pull the doppelganger towards Swamp Thing's body. And the doppelganger is struggling extremely hard. He's actually clawing the ground, and it looks like he's in fear as he yells, "No!" And we see Abby in the background, and she has her hands over her mouth like she's in shock. And then she sprints over to the doppelganger and yells, "Alec!" And then she collapses to the ground in front of him and grabs onto him, trying to pull him away from Swamp Thing. And the doppelganger says to her, "Abby, don't let go of me. Whatever you do, don't let go. Please believe me. I love you." And just as he says that, his body is pulled by Swamp Thing out of Abby's arms, and in tears, Abby yells out, "Alec!" And then we cut to a full-page splash of Swamp Thing absorbing the body of the doppelganger, and he's doing it through his stomach. So the doppelganger's lower half is inside of Swamp Thing, I guess. And as he's being absorbed, he yells out, "Abby!" And the way Swamp Thing is standing is like, this is his ultimate power move. Like, all these vines are shooting out of him and grabbing into the torso of the doppelganger. And they're, I'm assuming, just slowly pulling him into Swamp Thing's body. And as the last bit is drawn into Swamp Thing's torso, we hear the last words of the doppelganger say, "I love you." And we get a shot of Abby completely in tears, looking like she's in a lot of emotional pain. So Swamp Thing stands victorious and says, "It is over." Then we get flashes of all the different areas like the swamp and Gotham City where the plant life was freaking out during the fight, and it seems everything has calmed down now. Of course, everybody who died during that is still dead, but the plants have subsided. So while Abby is still crying on the ground, Swamp Thing walks over to her and says, "Abby, please don't cry." And he helps her to her feet and she says, "Alec, is that really you?" And Swamp Thing smiles and says, "Yes, it's really me." And then she slaps him in the face. And as she brings her hand down, we see that it is bleeding because his face is now covered with spikes and spines, and they scratched her skin when she hit him. And then she looks at Swamp Thing with what I can only say is hatred and says, "How could you?" And then she turns and runs back towards the house, and Swamp Thing calls after her saying, "Abby, let me explain." And she yells back, "Go to hell!" And Swamp Thing doesn't follow after her. And as he turns, he sees Lady Jane is standing there with Tefe. And Lady Jane says, "I told you it was not a wise idea." Then we cut to Abby, who's walking by her house. And as she reaches the front porch, and we see standing there waiting for her is Officer Rawls and Baron. And as she approaches, Baron says, "Miss Matthew Cable?" And Abby collects herself and answers, "I'm Miss Alec Holland now. Officer Rawls, what's going on here?" And Rawls answers, "Believe me, ma'am, I'd rather not be involved, but I have to do my duty." And then Baron raises his hand, which is full of wet papers, which I'm assuming are the court orders, and he pushes them towards Abby, saying, "Miss Cable, the state of Louisiana has declared that your child, Tefe, is to be made a ward of the court, pending further investigation." And Abby says, "What?" And then she looks at the man holding the papers, and she realizes who it is, and she lunges at him, saying, "I recognize you now. You're that sleazeball Nazi who ran those horrible commercials about me during the governor's race. So this is how you're getting back at us for losing the election?" And Baron stumbles back, but he catches himself, and he drops the papers at her feet, and then says, "Officer Rawls." And Officer Rawls grabs Abby and stops her from attacking Baron. And Abby yells, I'm not gonna let this asshole take my baby away from me. And Rawl says to her, calm down, girl. Gouging his eyes out, however good an idea it may seem at the time, won't help you get your little girl back. So Abby stops her attack, and as she stands there, thinking about the horrible day she's had so far, she says sarcastically, what else could happen? And the second she says that, we hear off panel something say, la 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 la. And we turn the page and we get a full page splash of what said that. And we see it is the ruler of the flower people, and he has grown the height of a skyscraper due to the disturbance in the green during the Swamp Thing's fight. And he is roaring loud above the trees, la la la. And with that, that is the end of the issue. So we'll have to see what happens with the Daisy King in the next issue. So if you have any comments, questions, or suggestions, you can email me at planestrains.and-comicbooks, all one word, at gmail.com. And remember, until next time, stay swampy.